It started with a folded slip of paper tucked inside the bobbin case of an 1890s Willcox Gibbs treadle sewing machine, a machine I had named Lydia when I pulled her out of a condemned textile mill basement 4 years earlier, rusted solid and seized with decades of lint and grime. That paper was the original notarized partnership agreement my stepdaughter swore had been lost in a move 3 years earlier, and finding it would not only halt a $720,000 museum sale in its tracks, but would eventually land her in a federal prison sewing line. Wearing a khaki smock I designed myself, her fingers threading a 100-year-old singer and stitching labels that print her perjury conviction docket number for the rest of her natural life. My name is Margaret, though most people called me Maggie, and I was 54 when my husband David died of a massive heart attack while changing the oil on his Ford F-150 in our driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. David had been a floor nurse for 32 years, a quiet man with calloused knuckles, and a way of looking at people like he was already diagnosing the wound they hadn't spoken aloud. In every set of scrubs he ever wore, he carried a folded photo of his first grandbaby, a Polaroid he'd refresh each time a new child came into the family, and he would tap his chest pocket before any conversation like a ritual reminder of why he worked. When he retired, we poured his entire $118,000 nursing pension into a single shared dream, building a collection of rare antique sewing machines together with his daughter from his first marriage, Kelly, my stepdaughter by law, but a girl I had raised since she was 9 years old after her biological mother passed. I taught her how to thread a needle when her fingers were still too small to manage a sharp point, sat beside her through algebra tears and high school heartbreaks, and somewhere along the way I had forgotten she was not my blood, because every maternal instinct in me had claimed her anyway. We spent 3 years hunting down 37 machines. We drove to estate sales in Kentucky, paid a flatbed driver to haul a 1910 Davis vertical feed out of a collapsing barn in Missouri, and negotiated with a collector in Pennsylvania who had a hand-cranked 1863 Grover and Baker that still had its original rosewood case. We restored each machine ourselves in David's workshop, a converted single-car garage with pegboard walls and fluorescent light bars that hummed at 60 hertz. I taught myself how to disassemble a vibrating shuttle assembly, how to reset timing on a 130-year-old head so the needle thread tension was smooth as butter, how to listen to the hook race and know by pitch whether the clearance was off by 1/1000th of an inch. The crown jewel of the collection was a pristine 1921 Singer featherweight still sitting in its bentwood case with the original key, and next to it, the one I loved most, a black lacquered 1890s Willcox Gibbs treadle with gold filigree on the arm and a bullet bobbin shuttle that slid out sideways. I named her Lydia because every machine deserves a name, and because the first quilt I ever made on her was for David's granddaughter Lydia, a king-size log cabin pattern in calicos and creams that took me 7 months of evenings. We had the entire arrangement notarized at a small credit union on Main Street, a 50-50 partnership between Kelly and me, and we made a promise stitched into the fabric of the whole enterprise. For each of our 6 grandchildren, we would hand-piece a king-size heirloom quilt, free of charge, using a different antique treadle from the collection for the top stitching. It was a promise that meant the machines would stay in the family, that they were not just assets but vessels for labor and love passed down. I remember the notary, a woman named Beverly with a wooden stamp that she pressed into the ink pad with a satisfying thump, and David standing beside me with his hand on my shoulder, his thumb rubbing small circles into the fabric of my blouse. He said, "This paper is your shield, Maggie. Keep it close." I tucked the agreement into the fireproof safe in the hall closet and thought nothing of it for 3 years. David's funeral was a blur of cheap carnations and casseroles that I couldn't taste, the kind of food that well-meaning neighbors drop off in foil pans with post-it notes that say, "Thinking of you." I sat in the front pew of the funeral home and watched people file past the closed casket, their faces a smear of pity and discomfort, and I remember the exact weight of the air in that room, thick and pressing, scented with lilies and old carpet. By the time the last mourner left, and the funeral director had handed me a plastic bag of memorial cards and guest book pages, the vultures were already circling. Kelly arrived with her husband Todd on the day after the burial. Todd was a man who wore golf shirts tucked into pleated khakis, his belt always cinched too tight so his torso bulged slightly above the buckle, and he had a smile that never quite reached his eyes, a smile that seemed to be calculating the value of whatever he was looking at. They walked into the house like it already belonged to them. Kelly kept saying, "We're just trying to protect you, Mom," While she sorted through the mail on the kitchen counter, tossing bills into a pile she labeled urgent, and sliding David's pension statements into a manila folder. Todd paced the living room with his cell phone clamped to his ear, muttering about appraisals and liquidity, and getting a specialist in here before the secondary market shifts. I was still in the fog of fresh grief, the kind where you can sit for 45 minutes staring at a wall and not realize any time has passed, but something about how quickly they wanted to inventory the collection, how they mentioned bringing in an estate specialist before the soil had even settled on the grave, made the back of my neck prickle. On the third morning after the burial, I was clearing David's workshop. I needed something to do with my hands, a reason to be in a space that still smelled like him, a mix of gun oil and old metal, and the faint cinnamon of the coffee he always kept in a thermos on the workbench. The walls were lined with pegboard. Every tool hung in its own silhouette traced in Sharpie, wrenches and oil cans and jars of brass presser feet, and leather belts and bobbins sorted by size. On a high shelf near the back, nested behind a row of mason jars filled with tiny screws and springs, I found a small wooden cigar box with a yellowed label that said Willcox Parts in David's shaky capital letters. I was holding it in both hands when Kelly wandered in from the house. She saw me, her eyes flicked to the box, and her voice came out too quick. "That's just junk, Mom. Set it here and I'll toss it with the rest of the scrap." She plucked it from my hands, her fingers cool and brisk, and dropped it into a cardboard trash bin by the door, already half full of shredded sandpaper and broken tension dials. Then she turned and went back into the house, the sliding glass door clicking shut behind her. I waited until I heard the second click of the kitchen door closing, then I reached into the bin and pulled the box out, slipping it under my sweater and holding it flat against my ribs. Something in my gut told me that David never kept junk. He was a man who labeled every drawer and sorted his screws by thread pitch. Junk did not get a handwritten label. Upstairs, behind the locked door of our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and pried the lid open. Inside was a nest of cotton thread spools, a few bobbins wound with black silk that had yellowed with age, a small glass vial of sewing machine oil, and a single envelope with my first name, Maggie, scrawled across the front in his handwriting, the letters slanting forward like a man riding against a deadline. I opened it and slid out a folded piece of lined notebook paper, the kind you tear out of a spiral ring binder, the edge still fuzzy. The message was short, written in the deep-pressed ballpoint he'd used for charting vitals, the grooves in the paper so deep I could trace them with my fingertip. It said, "Maggie, do not trust Kelly and Todd. They will try to take the collection and leave you with nothing. The original partnership agreement is the only thing that can protect you." I hid it where she would never think to look, inside the old Willcox and Gibbs you named Lydia. Remember how to pop the bobbin case straight out without tools. Save yourself, my love. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. I read it 3 times, the words swimming and then snapping into focus. Lydia was the machine I had restored 2 summers ago, the one with the gold filigree and the bullet bobbin shuttle that I had spent 3 weeks freeing from rust with gentle oil baths and patience. Kelly hated that machine. She said it took up too much space, that it was a dusty museum piece nobody would ever want to sew on, that we should sell it for parts. David had known. He had seen something coming, maybe in the way Kelly's eyes lingered on the collection when she thought he wasn't looking, maybe in a conversation he overheard, and he had planted a shield inside a machine she would never touch. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed should never be the thread that binds a family together. Now, back to what happened. I went downstairs with the note folded into my palm, but the garage was empty. The workspace where Lydia's treadle cabinet had stood, a corner I had organized myself with cones of thread, and a photo of David pinned to the wall, was bare. Kelly and Todd had already loaded several machines into a rented cargo van the previous afternoon, claiming they were taking them to a climate-controlled storage unit for safekeeping, a place I had never seen and the address of which they had conveniently not shared. I felt my pulse hammer in my temples, a sharp drumbeat of panic and anger. I found Kelly in the kitchen, sitting at the breakfast bar, sipping a latte from the coffee shop down the street and scrolling her phone like she was waiting for a pedicure appointment. I very carefully let my voice wobble and crack, let my posture slump, my eyes go glassy. "Honey, I think I left my grandmother's ring in the drawer of that old treadle cabinet you moved, the one with the gold decals. Can we go check the storage unit? It means the world to me." She barely looked up from her screen. "It's probably already at the unit, Mom. I'll dig it out next week. You've got enough on your plate." Todd appeared in the doorway, a protein bar in one hand, his jaw tight, and said they'd handle it, that I should rest. That grief does strange things to memory. I nodded, playing the fragile widow, and retreated. But I had lived in that house for 20 years, and I knew exactly where Todd kept the keyring for the cargo van, the small hook by the back door next to the flashlight, because he was the kind of man who treated keys like a wallet, always in the same spot or the world ended. I waited until they announced they were going out for a meeting with a financial advisor, something Todd said with a deliberate vagueness that made his voice slide up at the end like a question. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed the key, got into my own old sedan, and drove to the storage facility on the edge of town, the one with the orange roll-up doors and the cracked concrete lanes. I had found the unit number on a scrap of paper Todd had tossed into the kitchen trash, a slip with a handwritten code that matched the facility's labeling system. I parked outside Unit 47 at the end of the lane, and my hands were steady as I fit the key into the padlock and pulled the metal door up with a groan that echoed off the neighboring units. Inside, the machines were wrapped in moving blankets like bodies, stacked in rows. Lydia's cabinet was near the back, her distinctive curved silhouette unmistakable even under the padding. I pulled back the blanket, and there she was, her black lacquer dulled by the dust of the move but still shining with the deep amber of age. I lifted the machine head out of the cabinet mount, the weight of it familiar and solid in my arms, and set it gently on the cold concrete floor. And 1890's Willcox Gibbs uses a unique oscillating shuttle, different from the rotary hooks that came later, a design where the entire bobbin case slides into a dovetailed slot and locks with a spring-loaded latch that you release by pressing with your thumb. I tilted the head back to expose the undercarriage, found the latch and pressed. The bobbin case slid out smoothly into my palm, a small curved metal capsule. Inside it was the bullet-shaped shuttle, still threaded with black silk, and behind the shuttle, pressed so tightly it was thinner than a stick of gum and nearly translucent, was a square of cream-colored legal paper folded into 16ths. I worked it out with a pin I pulled from the hem of my jacket, unfolding it slowly on my knee. There, crisp and original, with the blue notary ink still bright after 3 years, was the partnership agreement, dated and signed by both Kelly and me. Witness line completed, the raised seal of the notary public faintly textured under my thumb. Attached to it with a paper clip was a letter of intent from the National Textile Heritage Museum, 3 pages on glossy letterhead, expressing interest in acquiring the complete collection for $720,000, contingent upon proof of clear title from both legal partners. David had hidden the one document Kelly needed to destroy, and he had hidden it inside a machine she had called worthless. I took a breath so deep it burned, then I folded the paper back along its creases, tucked it into the lining of my purse where I had stitched a hidden pocket years ago for travel documents, and drove home. Now I had the truth stitched in paper, but I couldn't confront them yet. I needed to see how deep the rot went, and I needed them to show their hand. Over the next few days I amped up my performance. I spoke in a soft, forgetful murmur, letting my sentences trail off into nothing. I left my reading glasses in the refrigerator, asked the same question twice within 10 minutes, and nodded along with a vague, trusting smile when Todd lectured me about the complexities of estate liquidation. I watched Kelly press a stack of documents in front of me one evening after dinner, the kitchen light harsh and fluorescent. She slid a pen toward me and said, "This is just a simple durable power of attorney, Mom, so we can handle all the legal transfers without bothering you. And this one dissolves the partnership so the museum can finalize the purchase. You trust me, right?" Her voice was honey and thorns. Beside the paperwork, she placed a check for $4,200, the paper crisp, the amount typed in the little box. "That's a little bonus from the early stages of the sale," she said. "Think of it as a spool of thread to get you started. A spool of thread on a collection worth $750,000. I blinked at the check, let my hand hover over it as if I were confused, and said my head was still foggy with grief, that I'd look at everything when I felt a little stronger. They exchanged a look, the kind of look that passes between two people who have rehearsed contingencies, and Todd's jaw flexed. But they retreated. The next morning, Todd announced they'd be moving me into their guest suite, "So you're not alone in this big house." He said it with the practiced concern of a man who had already called a moving truck. I knew it was control, full-time surveillance, but it also put me in the middle of their operation, sleeping under the same roof as every secret they were trying to hide. I packed a small suitcase, choosing my clothes carefully, and made sure to slide the partnership agreement into a hollowed-out sewing kit inside my overnight bag, the one that looked like a small wooden book with a magnetic clasp. I walked out of my own front door with my head down, playing the grateful victim, while inside I was cataloguing every lock and window and camera angle of the place I was about to enter. Living in their house was like being a ghost behind enemy lines. The guest room had a window that faced the side yard and a door with no lock, but I kept my mouth quiet and my eyes wide. I pretended to nap for hours beneath a quilt I had brought from home, but I tracked every sound. Within the first week, I noticed Todd having frantic phone conversations in the den, the door barely cracked but his voice carrying through the vent system in a way he clearly didn't realize. I started documenting times and phrases in a tiny spiral notebook I kept inside my bra, a trick I'd learned from a patient years ago who had done the same thing to track her medication schedule. Todd would say things like, "We need the museum wire to hit before the end of the quarter. The secondary loan is already past due." And no, she suspects nothing, she's practically catatonic, and once in a lower voice that made my stomach knot, "The obligor clause is airtight. Even if she figures it out later, she's already on the hook for the full principal." I wrote it all down, dates, times, exact phrasing. I also noticed the house was bloated with new purchases. A Sub-Zero refrigerator still had the plastic film on it, an 80-inch television hung in the living room with the setup sticker floating in the corner of the screen. Todd drove a newly leased Escalade that still had the temporary plate in the rear window. The math didn't pencil out for two people with no real income, and a mortgage I'd later learn was 3 payments behind. They were spending money they didn't have, and I was starting to see my name was on the hook for all of it. Then came the morning of the sink repair. The faucet in my guest bathroom started leaking into the cabinet below, a slow drip that left a rust-colored stain on the particle board and filled the small room with the smell of damp wood. Todd stood over it with a crescent wrench pulled from a kitchen drawer, grunting, his knuckles white, twisting the compression nut the wrong direction until water started seeping from the base of the fixture. "It's a lost cause," he muttered. "We'll call a plumber." I walked in, took one look at the setup and said, "Let me take a look," sliding past him with a flathead screwdriver I had noticed on the counter. During my years on the nursing floor, when maintenance was too slow and a flooded patient room couldn't wait, I'd learned basic plumbing, how to sweat carper, how to clear a trap, how to diagnose a cartridge failure by the pattern of the leak. I shut off the angle stops beneath the sink, disconnected the P-trap by hand, and pulled the ceramic cartridge from the valve body. The O-ring had hardened and cracked, a common failure in cheap builder-grade fixtures. I knocked the mineral buildup loose with the screwdriver, soaked the parts in a cup of white vinegar I asked Kelly to bring from the kitchen, and reassembled everything with a dab of plumber's grease I found in a forgotten tube at the back of the vanity. Within 20 minutes, the faucet was running clean and dry, not a single drop. Todd stared at me like I'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat, and Kelly blinked in surprise, her latte frozen halfway to her lips. I just shrugged and said, "Old nurse hands, they remember things." The shift was subtle, but after that they saw me as less of a teary-eyed pushover and more of an unpredictable variable. They stopped watching me quite so closely, assuming perhaps that a woman who could fix a sink might be more trouble than she was worth to surveil. That was a mistake. I began to wander the house at night when they were asleep, my footsteps silenced by slipper soles and my path lit only by the glow of the digital clock in the hallway. The third door on the left upstairs was Todd's home office, always locked with a basic Schlage knob, a 5-pin tumbler lock with no security pins, the kind you can bypass in under a minute if you know the feel. I had brought a small set of tools in my sewing kit, 2 stiff wire hooks I'd bent from a cut-up metal coat hanger back home before I left, a half-diamond pick with the tip filed down to 20,000ths of an inch, and a tension wrench shaped from the flat spring steel inside an old windshield wiper. Not violence, just an old skill I'd picked up during college summers working at a storage facility where we rekeyed abandoned units, and I'd spent slow afternoons practicing on the scrap locks. A Schlage knob with standard pin tumblers can be raked open in under 30 seconds with a half-diamond pick, and a tension wrench if you know the binding order. I knelt in the dark hallway, my knees pressing into the carpet fibers, slid my tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applied a light rotational pressure clockwise, and raked the pins 3 times with an upward jiggle motion. I felt the first pin set with a soft tick through the wrench, then the second, and on the 4th stroke, the plug turned with a snick that sounded to my anxious ears like a gunshot, but was actually just the quiet click of a lock surrendering. Inside, a metal 2-drawer filing cabinet sat beside a desk cluttered with contracts and a desktop computer whose screen was dark. The filing cabinet's top drawer had a wafer lock, even simpler, a single row of flat wafers that you can bypass with a jiggler tool cut from a paperclip. I unbent a paperclip from Todd's own desk, shaped it into a snake-rake profile with my fingers, inserted it, and jiggled it up and down while applying a light turning force with my thumb. The lock opened in under 10 seconds. Inside, a hanging folder labeled Liquidation 2023 was the jackpot. I pulled out the contents and photographed every page with my phone, careful to keep the flash off and the shutter sound muted. The documents laid out the entire scheme. There was a forged dissolution of partnership document, my signature traced so badly it looked like a child's practice sheet, the slant all wrong, the M in Margaret a wobbly loop that I would never make. There were wire transfer instructions to a numbered account at a bank in the Cayman Islands, the sort of account that requires a shelf company and a nominee director. And there was a personal loan agreement with a hard money lender called Redwood Asset Holdings, a company I'd later learn specialized in high-risk bridge loans at 32% annual interest, listing me, not Kelly, as the primary obligor and the entire sewing machine collection as collateral. They had attached a copy of my social security statement, likely obtained from David's old filing cabinet in the weeks after his death, and had set me up as the perfect financial scapegoat. If the museum sale fell through or the loan came due, I would be on the hook for over $400,000 in principal and accrued interest, and the machines would be seized. They hadn't just tried to steal my inheritance, they had tried to bury me in a debt designed to ruin whatever remained of my life. But I also found a document that stopped my breath, a standalone letter from the museum's acquisitions director, a woman named Margaret Hayes, dated 6 months before David's death. The letter was addressed to both partners and stated in formal language that the museum's purchase agreement required the physical presence of both original partners, with valid government-issued ID and the original notarized partnership agreement, at the final closing. A handwritten addendum at the bottom, in ink I recognized as David's, confirmed an additional stipulation. The sale could not proceed without this verification, per an agreement he had personally negotiated with the museum's legal counsel. David had built a dead man's switch directly into the sale. Without me physically present and willing, and without that exact piece of paper folded into Lydia's bobbin case, the museum couldn't release a single cent. I suddenly understood the full architecture of his plan. He'd known his daughter was plotting something, maybe for years, maybe just a whisper he'd caught at a family dinner when he was refilling his coffee, and he had embedded me into the transaction as the living key. As long as I was alive and in possession of the agreement, the sale was bricked. Kelly could forge 100 documents, but she couldn't replicate my body, my voice, my photo ID in a room with a museum official. That was his quiet, brilliant countermeasure. The next morning I waited until Todd and Kelly left for what they said was a consultation with a tax strategist. Then I walked a mile to a gas station on the corner and bought a prepaid burner phone with cash. I called the museum's number, the one printed on the letterhead. When Margaret Hayes answered, I said, "Mrs. Hayes, this is Margaret Caldwell. I believe you've been trying to reach me." She paused and I could hear the click of a keyboard stopping. "Mrs. Caldwell, yes. Your stepdaughter has been claiming you're incapacitated, that she has sole authority under a power of attorney. We've been stalling with procedural delays because our legal department flagged inconsistencies, but we need the original agreement and your personal verification. The board is getting nervous." I told her I had both. I explained the forged dissolution, the hidden agreement, the Cayman account, the predatory loan, the whole ugly quilt they'd stitched together. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she said, "I'm going to get our fraud specialist and contact the FBI art crime team. This crosses interstate lines, involves a federally regulated financial institution, and the dollar amount triggers mandatory reporting. Can you sit tight and not tip them off until we're ready to close the trap?" I said yes. We arranged a signal. She would send me a museum newsletter email with a specific phrase in the subject line, a phrase I'd recognize as the green light. I left the gas station and walked back, the burner phone tucked into my waistband, and I felt for the first time since David died that I was not fighting alone. But I needed to know if there was a single ember of humanity left in those 2 people rooming me, feeding me, pretending we were a family. I needed to see what they would do if I became an obstacle at the worst possible moment. So that Friday, I staged a medical scare in their kitchen. I had seen dozens of cardiac events on the telemetry floor where I'd worked as a nurse, the way the body slumps, the way the breath catches in a wet gurgle, the flutter of eyelids that signals the brain losing perfusion. I waited until Kelly was at the kitchen island scrolling through social media, her coffee cup leaving a ring on the quartz, and Todd was in the adjacent den on a speakerphone call, his voice loud enough to track. I took a breath, let my knees buckle, and crumpled onto the tile floor, my hip hitting the grout line with a thud that I knew would bruise deep. I grabbed my chest, my fingers clawing at the fabric of my sweater, and I let out a low, wet gasp, the kind of sound that on a real patient would send a crash cart rolling. I made my eyes flutter but not quite close so I could see. Kelly jumped, her phone clattering onto the counter. "Mom. Mom," she leaned over me, and for a split second I saw genuine panic, the wide whites of her eyes, her hand hovering over my shoulder like she might actually touch me. Then Todd strode in from the den, his face blank with calculation. He took one look at me, held up his hand and said, "No, stop, don't call yet. Get the final dissolution form from my office. If she's crashing, we need her signature now while she's still semi-lucid. The museum closes in 3 days. We cannot lose the wire because she decided to have a medical event on our kitchen floor." Kelly froze, her face cycling through a dozen expressions before settling into cold resolve. She stepped directly over my collapsed body, her foot passing within 3 inches of my outstretched hand, and she walked toward the door to retrieve the clipboard and pen. She did not check my pulse, did not touch my hand. She wanted my signature more than my breath. I lay there with my ear pressed to the cold grout, the smell of floor cleaner sharp in my nose, and I let the scene play another 40 seconds before I coughed, slowly sat up, and murmured something about low blood sugar, must have forgotten to eat breakfast. They helped me to a chair, Kelly's voice back to Honey, Todd patting my shoulder. "You scared us, Mom." But I had seen the rot at the center of the fruit, the black decay where a heart should have been. Whatever guilt I'd carried about what was coming next, the ruin I was about to bring down on a girl I had raised, evaporated like steam from a kettle. I was done. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning 3 days later. Kelly had dressed me in a soft lavender cardigan and helped me into the back seat of the Escalade, cooing that we were going for a lovely drive to see the collection one last time before it went to its new educational home, a museum where schoolchildren could learn about textile history. In reality, the museum had scheduled a final acquisition meeting at their administrative office in the restored textile mill downtown, a meeting I knew would be staffed with 2 FBI agents pretending to be legal counsel and a third monitoring from an adjacent room. Todd drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Kelly clutched a leather folio stuffed with the forged dissolution, the power of attorney, the waiver forms, the whole counterfeit stack. I sat in the back, my hands folded in my lap, my purse pressed against my side with the original agreement tucked into its hidden pocket, and I memorized the route, the red brick of the mill building when it came into view, the way the autumn light slanted through the tall windows of the boardroom. The boardroom had exposed brick walls and a long walnut table polished to a soft gleam. Margaret Hayes was there, her silver hair neat, her face carefully neutral, a folder open in front of her. Beside her sat a woman in a navy suit with a briefcase, who I recognized from the photos Margaret had sent me. Special Agent Lorraine Pelletier of the FBI's Art Crime Unit, her posture exactly the kind of relaxed readiness that law enforcement trains into their field agents. A second agent, a man in a charcoal blazer, stood by the door, his hands clasped in front of him. Kelly spread her papers like a dealer at a poker table, aligning the edges with practiced precision. "We have all the dissolution paperwork, the notarized power of attorney and Mom's signed release," she said, her voice bright and professional. "We just need to complete the transfer authorization so the funds can be released to the estate account." She pushed a fresh document toward me, a crisp white page with a signature line highlighted in yellow. "Just sign here. Mom, your hand might be shaky, so take your time." The faux tenderness in her voice was so thick I could have spread it on toast. I looked at the paper, then at her. Her eyes were wide and earnest, a performance polished to a high shine. I reached into my purse and withdrew the original partnership agreement, the creased legal paper still faintly smelling of gun oil and old thread. I unfolded it flat on the walnut table, smoothing out the creases one by one, the notary seal clearly visible under the recessed lighting. Kelly's face lost all color, the blood draining from her cheeks so quickly it was like watching water run out of a sink. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I burned that." She'd used a hard word, burned. She hadn't misplaced it, hadn't forgotten where she put it. She had deliberately destroyed everything she thought was the agreement, and she had lied to my face about it for 3 years. I held her gaze and spoke the line I'd rehearsed in my head 100 times, in the dark of the guest room, in the silence of my own mind. "You stripped your father's trust for parts and tried to stitch a lie into a fortune. But you forgot she who threads the needle controls the whole seam." Todd lunged for the paper, his hand outstretched, but Special Agent Pelladier was already on her feet, her badge out and her voice cutting through the air. "Mr. Hargrove, you're under arrest for interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. Please place your hands behind your back." 2 more agents entered from a side door, and Todd started shouting about warrants and lawyers and illegal search, his face red and sweating, but the cuffs clicked onto his wrists with a sound so final it echoed off the brick walls. Kelly screamed at me, her face twisted into something I had never seen before, a pure funnel of rage and disbelief. "You scheming old witch, I took you in, I fed you, I was going to give you a share." I shook my head and looked at the Spool check amount I would never forget. "A Spool check, Kelly. You mailed me a $4,200 Spool check on a machine worth $720,000. The only thing you ever gave me was proof of what you are." She was led out in handcuffs, her voice trailing down the hallway until it was just another sound in the old mill. The museum voided the fraudulent sale within 20 minutes, their legal team moving fast. Margaret Hayes embraced me in the hallway, her eyes wet, and told me the museum would renegotiate a legitimate purchase directly with me, at the same appraised value, once the criminal case was settled and my clear title was confirmed. The collection remained mine, protected by my husband's invisible last stitch. The aftermath was a slow, satisfying grindstone. Kelly was charged in federal court with 5 felony counts: forgery, perjury in the sworn dissolution filing, attempted elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and identity theft. She took a plea deal after the FBI presented her with the photographs I had taken in Todd's office, the burner phone recording of my conversation with Margaret Hayes, and the testimony of 3 museum employees who had documented her false claims of my incapacitation. The deal gave her 6.5 years in a minimum security federal women's facility, plus full restitution she could never pay, an amount that would follow her for the rest of her life. Todd, who had prior financial fraud charges in another state that I never knew about, including a dismissed case from 12 years earlier involving a real estate flipping scheme, got 8 years and a fine that swallowed everything he owned. Their assets were seized: the leased Escalade, the furniture bought on credit, the shell company they'd used to route the Redwood asset loan, the bank accounts with the residual cash advances. I walked out of the whole thing with my name cleared, my credit restored, and the original collection back in my possession. The museum closed the sale with me that winter, and I received a wire of $720,000, every cent appraised. But the money was never the point. I wanted the world to know what happens when you try to steal someone's legacy and leave them for dead. So I took a portion of the proceeds and founded Stitch of Deceit Quilts, a small batch quilting studio that makes heirloom quality hand-finished quilts using a rotating cast of the restored antique machines. I hired a master quilter to train a team, and we started producing pieces that museums and private buyers sought out. And then I made a call to the State Correctional Facilities Rehabilitation Program. Their textile shop teaches sewing and industrial stitch work to inmates, offering a trade certification upon release. I contracted with them to finish the binding and edgework on every one of my quilts, with a single stipulation that the warden agreed to sign into the memo of understanding. Kelly Caldwell, inmate number 82477-051, would be assigned to the line. Every day she sits at a treadle machine 8 hours a day, threading a 1907 Singer backstitcher, wearing a state-issued khaki smock that has the words "Unraveled Trust" embroidered across the back in burgundy thread. I designed the logo myself, a spool of thread unwinding into a broken chain. Every quilt that leaves that line carries a label sewn into the corner on cotton twill tape. This quilt was stitched with accountability. Docket No. 23CF0417. That's her federal perjury case number, printed in a serif font, wash-fast and fade-proof. It will never wash out, will never fray, and will be tucked onto the beds of grandchildren for decades. When I reflect on David's quiet genius, I picture him in his workshop in the last week of his life, the light from the single window catching the dust motes as he opened that bobbin case, tucked that square of paper just so, and then wrote me the note in the cigar box knowing I would find it when I was ready. He understood that family doesn't always mean blood, it means the people who would never step over your body to grab a pen. Boundaries are not betrayal, they are the hem that keeps a life from unraveling. My husband, a floor nurse who carried his grandbabies' faces in his pocket, built me a shield out of a sewing machine and a notary stamp, and that shield held. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments down below. If you believe that a promise stitched in good faith should never be sold for a quick profit, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Remember, sometimes the truth is folded into the smallest places, but it always unfolds at the right time. I'll see you in the next story.